Merhabalar arkadaşlar tekrar. Bugünkü programdaki ikinci konuşmacımız Doktor Pantelis Charalambakis. Kendisi sabah Olga Karayorgun'un da bahsettiği gibi Atina Akademisi'nin çatısı altında yürütülen Taktikon Araştırma Projesi ekibinden. Bulgaristan'dan, Sofya'dan katılıyor kendisi. Şu an bir müzesi de olan Bulgaristan Bilimler Akademisi Ulusal Arkeoloji Enstitüsü Numizmatik ve Epigrafi Departmanı'nda araştırmacı olarak aktif görevdedir. Doktor Charalambakis, Ioannina Yanya Üniversitesi Tarih ve Arkeoloji Bölümü Tarih kısmı mezunudur. Doktora çalışmalarını Ioannina Üniversitesi'nde tamamlamıştır. Problems of Historical Geography of the Pontus Exinus, the Crimea, Pontus Exinus bölgesinin tarihsel problemleri üzerine M.Ö. 1. yüzyıl, M.Ö. 6. yüzyıl arası dönemde Kırım üzerine doktora çalışması yapmıştır. Sorbonne Üniversitesi'nde Bizans epigrafisi ve paleografyası üzerine seminerlere katılmıştır. Kendisi aynı zamanda lisanslı turizm rehberidir. İlgi alanları Bizans sigillografisi, prosopografisi, Bizans tarihi, Balkanların Ortaçağ tarihi, Antik ve Ortaçağ dönemlerinde Kırım tarihi ve topografyası, Antik ve Ortaçağ dönemlerinde Doğu Avrupa coğrafyası ve kartografyası, toponimi ve antroponimi gibi alanlardır. Ayrıca kendisi bir Giritli olduğu için Orta Çağ'da Girit tarihidir. International Hellenic University School of Humanities'de Karadeniz Çalışmaları adlı yüksek lisans programında dersler vermiştir. 2019 yılından beri Bulgaristan'da Manastirsko, Orlovo, Mirovyane, Gorni Davrik gibi pek çok yerde kurtarma kazılarına katılmaktadır. Kendisi Olga Karayorgu ve Hristos Malatras'la birlikte birçok özel koleksiyon, sigillografik koleksiyon ve müze koleksiyonlarındaki tematik mühürleri yerinde incelemiştir. Ayrıca Bükreş'te Romanya Akademi Kütüphanesi'nde bulunan numizmatik departmanındaki koleksiyonu, Bulgaristan Şumen'deki Bölgesel Tarih Müzesi, St. Petersburg'daki Hermitage Müzesi, Moskova Devlet Tarih Müzesi, Paris'teki Bibliothèque Nationale de France ile Institut Français des Études Byzantines koleksiyonlarını, Münih'teki Staatliche Münsammlungen ile Bibliothèque Royale de Belgique, Belçika Kraliyet Kütüphanesi koleksiyonlarında araştırmalar yapmıştır. Birçok makale ve uluslararası bildirinin yazarıdır. Şimdi sözü kendisine bırakmak istiyorum. Microphone is yours, Dr. Charalambakis. Orista parakalı.
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody and thank you for being here. Before I start, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to friend and colleague, Associate Professor Dr. Güncel, for inviting me to participate together with Olga and Christos and herself in this series of online lectures. And of course, I thank the people of Bizantolog Network and the Koç University Stavros Niarchos Foundation Center for Late Antique and Byzantine Studies. I will share the screen now. Here. Also, I would like to thank the New Europe College and its people for giving me the great opportunity to conduct my research on this topic, which I present to you today, in Bucharest through a fellowship covering the academic year 2020-2021. The topic of my research, carried out thanks to the fellowship provided by the New Europe College, is ordinary people and their professions, the contribution of sigillography to the study of Byzantine social history. In short, it is about seals issued by professionals as freelancers in Byzantium, that is the Eastern Roman Empire, not directly related to the state or the church. The period under investigation spans from the 6th to the 12th century, and these two chronological borders were selected because the first marks the earliest seals that can be safely attributed to individuals as freelancer professionals, and the latter marks the time after which lead seals became very rare and used only by the upper class of Byzantium, apparently the cheap and easy to find wax gaining ground over the more expensive and hard to find metal. Considering that due to the large amount of specimens, that is seals, dispersed in many countries, The cataloging process is still in progress, and special attention will be put on the theoretical aspect of my work. In particular, I shall try to make you familiar with the theoretical approach of the issue, some of the questions that emerged, and the methods used in order to systematically collect and study the material. The pieces, the seals, are coming from museums and other institutes' collections, from private collections, and from auction catalogs or other sources related to the antiques market. Most of them are already published, but I also work on some unpublished specimens. Now, the background. Studies on the Eastern Roman Empire, what we conventionally call Byzantium today, started already in the Renaissance and post-Renaissance Europe in the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople. At that time, intellectuals were interested mostly in editing texts as well as in history as a sequence of events. Until the 16th century, what we now know as Byzantine was called Roman. But Hieronymus Wolff was the first to use the adjective Byzantine, which was until then ascribed to people originating from Byzantium, Constantinople, in a broader sense, naming Byzantine every citizen of the Eastern Roman Empire. And now, centuries after Wolff's Corpus Historiae Byzantinae, published for the first time in 1557, Byzantine studies have made not simply significant, but inconceivably great steps ahead. Each scholar and each country's school has contributed with a smaller or larger piece in building the path towards the understanding of this well-known and yet still so mysterious medieval world. Speaking about the 20th and now the 21st century, it is not only the amount of the newly discovered sources or the advance of technology that helped the specialists to push on in their research. It is also, and perhaps above everything else, the new perspectives and interpretations of what we already have in front of us. It is within this spirit that a great effort has been put lately in discovering the origins of the famous Byzantine provincial administrative system, or in determining the self-consciousness of the Romans, or as we shall call them from now on, the Byzantines, just to mention a few topics. On the other hand, it is true that more than often the availability of sources directs our research and limits the perspectives. In the case of Byzantine social history, scholars have touched almost every aspect of it, and new ideas are brought forward day by day. However, research relies mostly on literary sources, legislative and other official documents, historical works, hagiography, and to a lesser degree, epistolography and poetry. The study of Byzantine professionals, in particular, boosted after the discovery by the Swiss scholar Jules Nicole of the so-called Book of the Eparch back in 1891. The Book of the Eparch, or Book of the Prefect, because Eparch is the Greek term for prefect, is either an official document or the draft of such a text, a manual prepared to be used by an Eparch of Constantinople, who was, in modern terms, something like the city's mayor, but with more power and authority and reporting directly to the emperor. The manual includes instructions for the guilds of various professionals active in that city. Naturally, this document sparked a great interest among Byzantinists, who have now the opportunity to study closely the Byzantine professionals through a first-hand source. And yet, neither the Book of the Eparch and other legal documents, especially from the early period, nor the multitude of literary sources are coming directly from the professionals themselves. Scholars of modern studies rely on archival material, such as business correspondence, vouchers, invoices, etc., but almost nothing like this has survived from the Byzantine era, with the exception of a very few private notarial acts, mostly from Egypt for the early period and Italy for the late period. In this slide, you see a fragment from Papyrus from Afrodito in Egypt, dated in 645. It is a contract regarding the sale of a house, but what is important to us is that it mentions Aurelius Minas, son of Christophoros Pragmatevtis, that is a merchant, and Minas, son of Chichois Chalkopratis, a coppersmith. At the end of the document is mentioned Aparasios Nomikos, who was the notary who prepared the act. Apa means father in Coptic, which suggests that this notary was also a priest or a monk. There are, nevertheless, two categories of sources directly related to the professionals and in fact produced by them, which we have in large numbers: the inscriptions and the seals. The inscriptions are, for the most part, funerary texts inscribed on stone, and they mention the deceased's name and occupation, sometimes the date of the death, the age, the spouse's name, and the origin. See, for example, the gravestones of two Saldamari, that is grocers, and a Kramvitas, a greengrocer, from the 5th, 6th centuries. For the first one, on the left, the text says clearly that he was selling at the market. The third, at the bottom right, was, apart from grocer, also a fisherman, Kirtas, who was using a special hook for catching crabs. Next, you see the gravestone of a pragmatevtis, that is a merchant who died at the sea of at the area of Nea Anchialos in central Greece. But his place of origin was the island of Tenedos, Bosjada. The second is an inscription erected in Thessaloniki by a group of merchants originating from Apamia in Syria. So you see how much information one can take from 5 inscriptions only. And imagine how much is left to be discovered from the hundreds, if not thousands, of inscriptions available in museums of various countries. Unfortunately, there is no systematic study on professionals' funerary monuments. Sometimes there are also inscriptions on metal, such as on vessels or various instruments. Here you can see a lamp from Syria with a long inscription mentioning Sergios, Trivounos, and Argyropratis on the left. Trivounos in that period was an official serving at the state factory, and Argyropratis means the seller of silver objects. On the right, you see a balance or scales with a short inscription mentioning the owner's name, Evsevios. Again, there is no systematic study of these inscriptions. The same, surprisingly, applies to the seals directly related to Byzantium's working class, and this is the topic that I present to you today. So far, there are only 4 studies, short articles on seals issued by Byzantine professionals, and you see here the full references. We still lack an overview of the material and a more systematic and synthetic study on these professionals through their seals, published and unpublished, and also from auction catalogs. It must be stressed, though, that a study on lead seals alone cannot stand on its own. It is essential to examine, compare, and if necessary, combine information from other sources, such as literary texts and official documents, from historical works to epistles and private contracts, laws, monastic typica, and so on, as well as inscriptions on stone or metal other than lead. So in short, this is a rather complicated topic, combining a variety of sources. The file has arrived.
We can continue. I'm sending it to all the participants.
So I continue with English?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. Now, what is a seal and who needs it? Before going deeper into the details of the research topic, it is essential to explain in short, for those who are perhaps not familiar with Byzantine lead seals, what the seals are and how they are used. Although Olga already made a short presentation of the Byzantine seals. This information is important because it is connected to the next question: who needs, or more precisely, who needs to seal a letter or another document? Humans have been using sealing practices for millennia. At first, the seal was a symbol of personal power and authority, but also a tool in the hands of the state mechanism, used for practical purposes. Finally, the evolution of human society, combined with a series of other factors, such as the access of more and more people to literacy and written forms of communication, made it necessary for professionals and other individuals to use seals in order to protect the contents of their scripts or certify their authenticity. As for Byzantium, in short, people needed the seals in order to achieve three things: to secure a non-visible letter, to certify the authenticity of an open, visible letter, and to close a package that was intended for the market. So how did they use the seals? Unlike the modern ones, seals in antiquity were very different. Here you see how we use seals in stamps today, either with ink or with wax. There are other ways of security as well, such as these metallic clips attached to a metal cord. In the second photo, you recognize the security of a fire extinguisher. It was very common in antiquity to use cylindrical seals like the ones in these photos, leaving the imprint on soft clay or wax. There were also flat seals, which were working with the same method, as you can see, but also working with ink, such as this one on the right from ancient China. Other flat seals had various shapes and decoration, and these are from Egypt. And these are from Mesopotamia and from the Roman times. Here you see some more seals of various types. The bottom left photo shows the seal on the door of one of the inner shrines of the Egyptian king Tutankhamun. Another category of seals is the sealing rings that leave the imprint on the surface where you press them. These are from various countries and eras. And the third one in the second row is Byzantine with a Greek inscription. And usually such rings were made of gold or silver. And here you see that they are still in use today, mostly by famous people. As for late antiquity and the Middle Ages, there were two types of sealing practices involving either a metal disc or wax. The latter, which is not a durable material, unfortunately, has not survived. And yet, occasionally, people are still using this method of sealing until today. In this photo here, you see a medieval English document bearing dozens of wax seals. But in this case, the seals do not keep the document closed, they only validate its authenticity. In the next photo, you see how the seals are attached to the thin strings and keep the documents closed and secured. As for the first type, the lead seals, we know of several dozens of thousands of metal discs in gold, lead, gold, and silver, issued by people of that time in the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium. The golden seals were reserved for the emperor exclusively. The silver ones were used only by certain local rulers in the late period, and the lead seals were used by everybody, including the emperors. These seals were metal discs of small diameter, as Olga said before, 1 to 5 centimeters, like a modern coin, more or less, on which the owner was putting images and or text. Producing a seal was easy, but still required a particular procedure. First, the person interested in having seals was looking for a technician who would make a bouleuterion. The bouleuterion was an iron, pliers-like instrument whose two touching edges were flat on the inside. Here you can see how they are flat. There, the craftsman, the same person who made the instrument or another one, was carving on the flat surfaces an image, a text, or whatever the commissioner had asked for, creating a negative for the future imprint. You see it here, for example, part of the inscription. The next stage would be the production by the same person or another of small metal discs, such discs, with an open channel running through them. This is the channel. And you produce them through these molds. The discs were produced massively in molds, and no matter whether these discs were easy to find in the proper size or not, apparently they would not have been costly. The Bolotirion, however, seems to be an expensive thing, and the more exquisite the work, the higher the price. Here you see the steps. What exactly do you need in order to make a Byzantine seal? A digital presentation of a Byzantine Bolotirion, accompanied by photos of and information on the original, can be found on the website of Dumbarton Oaks. And here is the link. One note, which is not in the text, I have used for my presentation today and the next presentation on Wednesday, mostly seals from Dumbarton Oaks website, so that it's easier for the audience to find them. I have provided also the links. Sometimes this was not possible, but mostly I have done this. Now, it is important to say that sometimes in the early period, for commercial seals, they were using an instrument with a single printing surface. And here you can see some examples of such early one-side seals on the top row, while the others are the common two-side discs used in Byzantine times. In short, the sealing procedure was the following. The person had to roll the paper, tie it with a thin cord, then pass both edges of the cord through the channel of the blank disc. After that, the disc would be placed horizontally between the two flat surfaces of the Bolotirion, whose lower part would be touching a solid surface, and the person, holding the instrument tightly with one hand, would strike the upper part with a hammer. The lead, being a soft metal, would allow the disc's surfaces to accept the imprint of the negatives from the Bolotirion, and thus, after releasing the disc from the instrument, you have not only both sides printed, but also the letter secured, because the strike has pressed the channel and closed it around the thread. When they wanted to open a letter, they would either cut the thread or pull the lead disc, and this is why usually at least one of the channel holes is broken with an opening towards one side of the disc. In this photo, you see seals of the type I just described to you, still hanging from the manuscripts. And here you see Byzantine mosaics or illuminated manuscripts showing how people were keeping and holding the sealed documents. Now about Byzantine seals and Byzantine professionals. The seals are one of those instrumenta used by scholars for the study of Byzantine administrative, political, ecclesiastical, prosopographical, and lately social history. Although the first work on such seals appeared as early as the 18th century, only sporadically scholars tried to approach them systematically. I shall mention the names of Gustave Schlumberger, Vitalien Laurent, and Georges Zakos. With the development of Byzantine studies, and because these seals are first-hand sources, their importance has increased significantly in the past 4 decades. This is also thanks to the amount of publishing activity, the many archaeological expeditions and excavations, all the new collections now being available to the public, the auctions being available online, etc. And yet, although seals are so important for Byzantine studies, from the available material, which is estimated to be over 100,000 specimens, only the seals related to the church, the state, and the aristocracy have been approached and sufficiently examined. Byzantine professionals from lower classes who issued seals have been occasionally mentioned in various academic publications. But we are still lacking a systematic collection and study of all this material. As I mentioned before, scholars have not investigated much this topic for various reasons, which I shall try to summarize here. First, there is the traditional presumption that all Byzantine seals were issued by important people, either state employees or members of the clergy and the aristocracy, and in any case by wealthy and notable people. Second, there is a selective approach towards this phragistic material. It is exactly because seals of such professionals are considered less important when compared to the seals of well-known military commanders or aristocrats known through literary sources or patriarchs and so on, that scholars have not paid the necessary attention to them. The same practice is being followed against iconographic seals or specimens showing only monograms or anonymous inscriptions. Usually, scholars neglect them and publish only the very best pieces of a collection. A third reason is related to archaeology. Professionals who were using seals for their correspondence are more likely to be encountered in urban centers or at least in busy places. Of course, there is always the possibility that they were operating in more distant or isolated or less busy places. But in general, the professionals needed to be among many people in order to work. Let us not forget that at that time, it was difficult to cover long distances, so it is more likely that a busy craftsman who needs correspondence and seals would be based at a busy place. The same for a medical doctor, a butcher, and so on. Even if a small, isolated village had a butcher, for example, we cannot imagine how he would write letters, or who would be writing them for him, and why would he need seals. That being said, the problem is that most busy places, that is the Byzantine cities, are under currently inhabited cities, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to uncover the layers beneath. Excursus, this is a topic also touched by Olga before. Fortunately, there are still some large Byzantine cities that are not covered by later strata and have been or are currently systematically excavated, such as Corinth, Pergamon, Kherson, which you see here on the map, Gortina, Justiniana Prima, and now Amorion, to name only a few among the most important. Apart from the large cities, there is a lot of research in small places, such as fortresses and monastic complexes, where it is, however, less likely to encounter seals of professionals. To my knowledge, no such seals have been excavated in fortresses or monasteries as yet. After having collected as many seals of professionals as possible, it is surprising to see that only a few occupations are mentioned on the seals of their owners. There are still many professionals known through other sources with no known seals. It is possible, of course, that for one reason or another, these people did not own a bulloterion, but most likely, if not certainly, it is because we have not yet discovered the seals of professionals, such as, for example, Toxopios, that is the bow maker, and the Ervolavos, that is the chief of the workshop, or a contractor, or a businessman. Now, what can a seal tell us about Byzantine professionals? Byzantine seals of this kind, issued by professionals, although more modest in their appearance and for this reason less talkative compared to others, for example, those issued by high military officials or members of the aristocracy, still provide us with ample information on the owner's name, origin, ethnicity, spoken language, religious attitude, occupation, level of literacy, wealth status, artistic preferences, and so on. One should keep in mind, though, that not all this information appears on the same seal. Some things we may see on one piece and some things on another. Let us start with the name, the origin, and the language. The name of the person may give a clue about the origin or the ethnicity of the seal's owner. Alternatively, this information can be deduced if one takes a look at the language on the seal's inscription. For example, the person may have a Hebrew, Syriac, Turkic, or Arabic name, but the inscription is in perfect Greek. In this category is placed the late 10th century seal of a certain Solomon, Pragmatevtis, that is merchant, showing a bird and a Christian invocative inscription. Also, the seal of Phuredzis, Pragmatevtis, another merchant, dated in the late 11th or early 12th century, and showing the image of Theotokos on the obverse. It is possible that Phuredzis was of Persian or Arabic origin. Another interesting seal was issued by a certain Vaianos, Notarios, that is notary, solicitor, or it could also mean the scribe. Although the seal bears Christian symbols, the name shows Asiatic origin, perhaps from the tribe of the Avars, because we know of Avars bearing this particular name, Vayanos. What is most surprising, though, is the early date of this seal, probably in the first half of the 8th century. It means that a foreigner, or a descendant of foreigners, in Byzantium had got some proper education which enabled him to work as a solicitor or scribe. The religious attitude or preference is related to the iconography on the seal, usually shown on the obverse. For example, we may encounter Christian or pagan symbols, iconoclastic or non-iconoclastic motifs, preference to a particular holy figure or another motif, and so on. An indicative example is the seal of Stephanus on Nafarios, that is a fuller, textile worker, dated in the first quarter of the 10th century and showing 2 cypress trees. We also saw cypress trees before Olga's lecture. This unusual motif is attested rarely on other seals, but the 2 trees or branches are, when it is attested, they are always placed on each side of a human figure or an inscription, while here they stand alone. The most common motifs, though, are those of the Christian cruciform invocative monogram, the cross, as well as the images of Theotokos or a saint. A good example is the early 6th century seal of Johannes, Notarios, showing St. Peter and Paul holding a staff cross in the middle. It happens so that we also encounter some pagan motifs, especially in the early centuries. See, for example, the eagle and the star decorating the seal of a certain Sirikios, Physiologos, which means the medical doctor. This name Sirikios might be of Persian or Armenian origin. The level of literacy is also very helpful because it gives information about 2 people, the owner of the seal and or the bulloterion maker, whom the professional in question has hired. Some of the features that we take into account when studying the inscription of a seal is whether a text is in meter or if there are spelling mistakes, dialectal forms and idioms, etc. In general, seals issued by Byzantine professionals bear, aside from the invocation, short and simple inscriptions, usually mentioning only name and occupation. Still, this little evidence is enough to lead to certain conclusions, especially when the specimens are studied in groups. From the individual cases, it is worth mentioning Vayanos, you saw his seal before, whose name is misspelled Vayayu. I return to the seal, and it is in genitive instead of the correct Vayanu. That should be the correct form in genitive, although in fact the name should have been in dative Vayano because of the invocation. This happened either because this is how he said or wrote it to the craftsman, his name, or because this is how the craftsman, or the scribe, being unfamiliar with such an exotic name, he heard it. Last but not least, a seal can reveal some information about the wealth status of its owner, as well as the skills of the craftsman. I'll give you an example. If the inscription is well written and carved without mistakes, or if the decoration is well executed and abundant in details, this means that the owner had employed a good and skillful technician, which means an expensive technician. The opposite may also happen. If the seal looks very bad with mistakes, not very well executed work in general, the owner did not have enough money or perhaps did not wish to invest for a good technician. Let us compare 2 specimens, both dated in the same period, that is the late 11th, early 12th and 12th century respectively. The first, on the left, belonged to a merchant called Johannes. On the obverse is depicted a Patriarchal Cross with Florence and a circular inscription. It is a common motif, this cross, being in fashion since the early 10th century, the cross with the Florence. And this one in particular is not even well executed. The second seal belonged to the medical doctor Mühürleri. This one not only bears a metrical inscription, but also the unusual phrase, "heed the example of this life," and shows a standing figure looking upwards and raising the hands in prayer, and surrounded by two seated figures, a goat and a serpent. The difference between these two specimens is striking. One is following an old motif and is poorly executed. The other bears a metrical inscription, an unusual and rich in details image, as well as this didactic phrase, "heed the example of this life." No wonder that the second craftsman needed much more time and effort to carve all these, and one may suspect that the price for the work was higher. Now, were these professionals freelancers or state employees? The merchants, the doctors, and so on. Since the very beginning, this research has inevitably led to a series of questions which have though been formulated in one way or another in previous works touching the topic. I already mentioned the traditional scholarly view, according to which there are no freelancers in Byzantium and that everybody works for the state. Let us now return to the previous questions. Who needs the seals in Byzantium and who can use seals in Byzantium? As the direct successor of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine was naturally a state based first and foremost on an elaborate bureaucratic mechanism. Therefore, after the emperor, the biggest need for seals comes from the state itself and the thousands of its officials, from high-ranking prefects and military commanders to low-ranking clerks and scribes. Then comes the church and the various religious foundations and institutions. And finally, the aristocracy. It is understandable, though, that many professions require correspondence and professionals need seals for this, for example, the merchants, the notaries, the medical doctors, and so on. There is no known law in Byzantium saying who can own and use a bouleuterion and seals and who cannot. Neither anything like this is ever implied directly or indirectly in any source, at least not one that has been discovered. Nevertheless, scholars have assumed in the past that only state-related employees, the church and the aristocracy have the right to own a bouleuterion. This is a misconception which can be rejected by taking a closer look at the sources themselves. Of course, it is true that not everybody needs a seal, but even if they did, another question would be who has the financial means to own and use a bouleuterion? One must not neglect this financial aspect, which I already mentioned, and must also keep in mind that although the materials themselves, that is lead for the discs and iron for the bouleuterion, may be cheap or easy to find, it is also about who and how produces the tool and the discs and the cost of acquiring the processed objects. Regarding the fundamental question whether these professionals were acting as freelancers or they were state employed, we may say that in Roman times, things were clearer about their statuses, and we know that they were freelancers. But in Byzantium, the whole issue gets more complicated because of the limited sources and the state's intervention to every aspect of the economy. It is known since long, probably since the discovery of the so-called Book of the Eparch in the late 19th century, that the state exercised a considerable and strict control over every activity within its borders, and especially over transactions and activities related to the economy. Hence the question whether the professionals were freelancers with their businesses supervised and to a small or large degree controlled and limited by the state, or they were themselves state-employed servants and officials. This last question, of course, does not apply to every existing occupation, and for this reason, my research is limited to those attested on seals. There are a few points we must pay attention to. First, that although we know of three tactica, the so-called Uspensky, that of Philotheos, and the so-called Escurial, and even more descriptions of the state mechanism and its employees in other texts, the occupations in question are not mentioned in any of these sources. Second, that Byzantines enjoyed very much showing off with their honorific titles, and as we know very well, public servants and state officials, as well as the aristocrats, were very keen on exhibiting them on their seals. With a very few exceptions, that is no more than 5 specimens until now, the seals of the professionals that I have collected for my research do not show any honorific titles. Third, that through literary and official documents, we get the idea that these people were not public servants. To demonstrate only a few examples, the Pandectis informs us about the salaries of the private notaries. Then, in the novella of 966, issued by the Emperor Basil II, we learn about the merchants, locals and foreigners who gather for the open markets. In private contracts and notarial acts from southern Italy or other places of the empire, there are several professions mentioned as practiced by freelancers. Also, through private letters exchanged between Jewish families, we learn that many Jewish merchants were active in the Byzantine city of Atalia in the 1020s, and these could not have been state employees. The Emperor Leon VI advised his generals to take good care of the merchants because the state needs them. I believe that these examples, and many more, are enough to convince us that some professionals were freelancers, their activities perhaps controlled by the state to some degree, but still they were not state employees themselves. Other questions of no less importance are whether state employees were allowed to have occupations aside to their primary one, or if the clergy was allowed to practice such professions. Textual sources, as well as recent research, have shown that there was no consistent legislation about these matters, although from time to time the state was discouraging or even forbidding by law certain categories of people to practice side occupations simultaneously with their main one. And last but not least, there is the question regarding the position of women. An essential and equally important topic related to professions in Byzantium is the place of women. After we have discussed on many seals issued by males, it is only natural to wonder whether there were female professionals in Byzantium. Unfortunately, so far, no such seals belonging to women have been spotted. Considering, though, the low percentage of seals issued by women in general, this may or may not be accidental, meaning perhaps we have not been lucky enough to discover such pieces yet, but we have to work with what is available, which is not promising. Does the absence of seals mean that women were not allowed to practice such jobs, or it is only a matter of time and luck to discover their seals? In fact, women in Rome and Byzantium were allowed to work, as they were allowed by law to have their own property under special circumstances usually, for example as widows. Famous is the case of Danilis, you see here a depiction of her, the very rich widow whose land property and riches impressed even the emperor himself in the 850s, and it is said that she was even helping him, the emperor, financially. Moreover, we know through literary and epigraphic sources that women were practicing professions mostly related to production and market, but also medical ones, such as nurses and even doctors. On the other hand, it seems that, depending on their social status, they should not be engaged in professional activities. When Emperor Theophilos learned that the merchandise ship that had impressed him so much in the harbor belonged to his wife, the Empress, he exploded in anger, he ordered the ship to be destroyed with all of its cargo, and he forbid the Empress from engaging herself in shipping and trade, an activity which, apart from the financial benefit, it had apparently amused her pretty much. And yet the Empress was not the only woman engaged in shipping. Be that as it may, apart from textual evidence and despite the lack of seals, we can see women working on reliefs and other images, such as these ones from 3rd century Italy, where a woman is selling poultry, eggs and meat. And in the next one, the man is cutting the meat while the woman is doing the accounting. And because of her sitting position, her clothing and the hairstyle, it has been suggested that she was the owner of the business and not an employee. The variety of non-church related occupations and professions practiced by women in Byzantium is reflected in Eleni Marvarus' recent book written in Greek entitled Titles and Professional Names of Women in Byzantium. The author has done a great work with sources and has collected all known occupations and professions, which she summarized in the table which you see here. From the dozens of names, I should only point out to Galactopolisa, the milk seller, Epihirimathias, the businesswoman, Iatrena, Iatrini, and Iatromea, that is the medical doctor, or even the doctor gynecologist, Kapilisa, Tavernaria, which is the owner of a tavern or a worker at a tavern, Creopolis, the meat seller, Lachanopolis, the vegetable seller, the grocer, Navklirisa, the ship owner, Xenodochos, Pandochevs, Pandokisa, the inn owner, Pragmateftria, the merchant, Zagarina, the shoemaker, Chalkisa, the coppersmith, and so on. Another important term denoting a female occupation, not attested in Marvarus' book, is ergastiriarchisa, which means the chief of the workshop. And this term is included in the Dictionary of the Byzantine Vocabulary, published by the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And now we may proceed to the seals with professions in groups. Although not every known profession practiced in Byzantine times is attested on seals, we can still count a fairly large number of them. Apart from the ones enlisted below, I shall simply mention that of Xenodochos, the innkeeper, Vestiopratis, the clothes seller, Tavularios, the solicitor, Syrikopratis or Olosyrikopratis, the silk merchant or silk worker, and etc. The first profession that I will present is that of Christopheleptis the Goldsmith. It is known since long ago that the Byzantine state was in control of the most precious metals and other goods, such as silk and porphyry, and of course gold was not an exception. In this respect, there are no seals of freelancers working with gold. There are, however, seals issued by two, so far, known Christophelepti. On both seals, there is mention of the person's honorific title, and one of the inscriptions also mentions a second office, occupation, of this imperial Vasilikos, Christopheleptis, thus leaving no doubt that they were working for the state. Despite the fact that they are not freelancers, I have included them in the presentation for a comparison to other occupations working with metals. Both specimens are dated in the second half of the 11th century. The first seal was issued by certain Johannes, who chose the image of St. John Chrysostom for the obverse, not only for being his namesake, Johannes, but also for employing the word for gold, chrysos, which makes an allusion to his occupation and art, but also to his honorific title. So, chrysos, chrysoglyptis, chrysotriklinon, chrysostomos. As for the second seal, it was issued by a certain Euthemios, who chose to portray Saint Euthemios, who bears the same name. And we see how people in the Middle Ages were using their imagination in a very clever way to make their seals as much presentable and smart looking as possible, just like people do nowadays with modern business cards and introduction cards. The next profession is the chalkopratis, that is the coppersmith or copper handler or copper merchant. A lead seal of Theophanes, Chalkopratis, was discovered in Sudak in the Crimea, and this is, to my knowledge, so far the only published seal of this occupation. The Chalkoprati in particular are not among the professions directly mentioned in the book of the Eparch, perhaps because they were not considered as important as the others for the state and for the state economy in general. But in the book's first paragraph on the Argyroprate, who were dealing with silver, it is clearly stated that these dealers of precious metals and stones should not buy copper or other cheap materials that should be traded by other people. And apparently these others, the other people, are the chalkoprate. The third category of people dealing with metal are the argyroprate. The term argyropratis had three meanings, that somehow related to each other: silversmith, jeweler, and moneylender, but they certainly refer to different occupations. What is certain is that all three require a lot of communication with suppliers, partners, and clients, yet it is no surprise that these professionals were using seals. The Argyroprate, together with the merchants and the notaries, lawyers, and solicitors, count the most specimens in my database. Some of these persons must have issued a lot of seals, because even 4 specimens per person have been recorded, and they come from different places of the empire. And here you see an example, the 7th century seal of Ioannis Argyropratis. It says, Ioannis Argyropratis, servant of Theotokos. Surprisingly, we know of the seals of at least 2 clergymen, deacons, who were at the same time Argyroprate. In this case, the term has the meaning of the moneylender, an occupation which the state discouraged the clergymen for practicing, and in later times even forbid it by law. It seems, though, that in the 6th, 7th century, these diaconi found a way to make money and were even using seals advertising their double and illegal at that time occupation. Let me note here that 3 seals issued by Pavlos are known, and one of them was discovered on Mount Eleon in Israel. Remember that I showed you before papyrus in which a priest or monk appears as a notary. Clergymen were very often practicing side professions, either legally or illegally. Now let's proceed to another category of professions, starting with ambelas, the vine grower or vine dresser. Although the word ambelas is mentioned in many literary sources, there is only one known lead seal belonging to a person with this occupation. He is Theodosios Alexopoulos Ambelas from the 12th century. This seal provides us with a lot of information, since it shows the name and family name of the person, the profession, as well as some level of literacy, because it bears a metrical inscription. Ambelas here is an occupation and not a family name, which is already mentioned. Moreover, it must be noted that despite the fact that in most Byzantine texts the word ambelas means the worker in a vineyard, in this case Theodosios Alexopoulos must have been the owner of the vineyard, producing grapes and or wine. And apart from the seal, you can also see images of Byzantine people working with wine and grapes. Now, there is only one known seal of a Saldamarios, grocer, dated in the second half of the 10th century. The Saldamari are mentioned in the 13th chapter of the book of the Eparch. They were allowed to keep their shops at any place in Constantinople and trade almost every kind of food, apart from fresh meat, as well as other processed goods or wooden and metal stuff, with a few exceptions, such as soaps and perfumes, which were reserved for some other occupations. The fresh meat, which was not allowed to the Saldamarios, was handled by the Macellarios, the butcher, the fresh meat seller. This term, Macellarios, later also spelled Macelitis, had several meanings, or the meaning was changing depending on the era. In Roman times, there were many terms, each for one particular occupation with specific tasks. In Byzantine times, though, it seems that all these old words were abandoned, with the exception of Macellarios and Macelitis. The Macellari, as well as other professionals in the food business, were working at a market called Macellum. Here you see the plan and representation of such a Macellum from the late antique period. Sorry. It is interesting that several Macellari, all dated in the second half of the 10th century, chose to illustrate their seals with animals, a dog, a griffin, and a lion. This could be, of course, explained by the general tendency of people to use animals' figures on their seals in that period. But perhaps there is another interpretation, that the images are related to their occupation with animals, that is, their seals were again working as business cards, advertising the owner's profession, because all these animals, real or mythical, are related to hunting. Another information worth mentioning is that there is this unique specimen from the first half of the 11th century discovered in Silistra and kept today at the Regional Historical Museum of Dobrich. On the obverse, there is an image of St. Nikolaos. Unfortunately, the image was too bad to use it here. And on the reverse, the inscription Nikolaos, Vasilikos, it is imperial, Makelitis, in dative. If the reading is correct, then this butcher was working for the palace or for another state institution close to the palace, probably in Constantinople. Alternatively, he was not a butcher, but the person who was handling the orders for meat at the palace or wherever he was working at. Although there must have been many mangipi, bakers in Byzantium, only one 10th century seal is known. This one. And the picture on the right shows a baker in action preparing the bread. I have already presented before some seals issued by professionals such as the Nafarios, the textile worker, the Pragmatevtis, the merchant, the Notarios, the notary or solicitor or scribe, and the Physiologos and Iatros, the medical doctors. So the last seal I'm going to present to you was perhaps, according to its editor, issued by a musician whose name was Marinos or Marianos. Both words, the name and the profession, are given in genitive through two monograms, one on each side of the disc. Provided that the interpretation of the second monogram is correct, musikos, this person could indeed have been a musician, because in the 6th century, when the seal is dated, there were no family names. And this brings us to a last question, nouns or names. When looking at nouns indicating occupations in source, either literary or epigraphic, the first automatic reaction is to think of the profession itself. It happens so, however, that in the course of time, humans turn these appellatives into occupational names. This phenomenon, occurring in almost every language, leads to a high number of people bearing family names that are identical to the nouns describing their occupation, or most likely that of an ancestor. Recent research has shown that family names in Byzantium first appear around the second half of the 8th and the very early 9th century. Although most of these names seem to be nicknames attributed by iconoclasts to iconoclasts by iconophiles, many among them eventually turned into family names. Naturally, occupational names are commonly attested in Byzantium, but they are frequently encountered, especially from the 11th century onwards. Knowing that occasionally before, but certainly during the 11th century, and of course later, it is possible to encounter an occupational family name, researchers must be very cautious when the source does not make it clear whether it is about a noun or a name. For the sake of brevity, only a few Byzantine occupational names will be enlisted with a direct or closest English equivalent family name. So I will mention Byzantine family names and their English equivalent family name, which is in use today. Amaxas, in English Carter, and also Cartwright and Wainwright. Varelis, Varelas, in English Cooper. Zographos, in English Painter. Keramefs, in English Potter, Harry Potter. Kirularios, Chandler. Macellarios, Butcher. Miropsos, Spicer. Xylergos, Sawyer, or Wright. Ikodomos, Mason. Pragmatevtis, Monger, or Merchant. Raptis, Tailor, a very common name. Chalkevs, Smith, yet another very common name in English. Other Byzantine family names are Musikos, musician, Trapezitis, banker, moneylender, and so on. In this respect, the material from earlier periods is easier to handle. As for the later centuries, though, in many cases it is difficult to say whether the word indicated a profession or a family name. Sometimes it happens so that the inscription already includes a first name and a family name, and thus the noun we are interested in shows most likely a profession. In other instances, the inscription structure might be of some help. Be that as it may, the issue of recognizing and distinguishing the noun from the name must be treated with caution. And before I conclude, I would like to point out once more the importance of combined evidence from seals and other sources. And I hope that despite the limited time, which does not allow me to present to you the whole material, all of its aspects and all the questions, that you still got an idea, a good idea about the topic. The study of seals will certainly reveal more aspects of the life of Byzantium's working class and will contribute to the study of Byzantine social history. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor.